Okay, welcome everybody to Council-led Housing Forum. Today's topic is risk management. And we've got a pretty packed morning, so we'll get to the agenda in a minute. So my name is Viska Sri Chandrasekera, and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager. Council-led Housing Forum is hosted by Future of London and sponsored by Redloft, BPTW and Potter Raper, as well as the GLA. So here's our agenda this morning. We've got two breaks in here, as you can see, so a very short break at about 10:25. And then we have a proper tea break, or I call it a proper tea break, at about 11. So that's the 10 minutes. Definitely going to get a cup of tea or coffee, whatever you want then. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the detail of this. You've had this agenda, it was sent out with your confirmation, and you have details of all of our speakers with their biogs on the agenda as well. So we're going to get straight into it this morning with risk management, where we have Sam Phelps and Tom Shrewey, both from Redloft, and they are going to give us a sort of mini masterclass, I think I'll call it, from an organisational perspective around risk management. Tom and Sam, I'm just going to pass straight over to you. And I'm going into your first slide.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I guess I just wanted to start with a bit of context in terms of what we're intending to do today. Redloft are a consultancy service, and we, within Redloft, have three different parts of our organisation. We've got a development consultancy team, a land and viability team, and a sales and lettings team as well. And we work with councils, local authorities, other local authorities, RPs and developers. And in the context of risk management, I guess it's the process of that collaborative experience that we are, as an organisation, offering to our clients. And that's both in terms of the projects and the wide range of projects that we work on and consult upon, but also with the different organisations that we work within in terms of their structure. So we're able to bring together that experience and hopefully bring some real value to the clients that we work for. Today, what we're going to cover is what is a risk, what is risk broadly, what is risk appetite, and at an organisational level what that means, the task of building a risk map and a risk assurance map, a framework, and risk management at a project level, and we'll be trying to learn from some of our projects and the experiences that we have. So on that, over to my colleague Sam. So next slide, please.
Okay, thank you, Tom. What is risk? I mean, it's such a huge topic, isn't it? Yeah, we've got sort of 15-20 minutes to sort of whistle-stop tour. So I've put some quotes up on there. So you've got Association of Project Management, Body of Knowledge, and the Orange Book of Treasury guidance on there. I won't go through every single quote, but what each of them agrees with is that development is inherently risky because it's new. So it's not about eliminating risk, but actively managing risk. So it's not conducted in isolation, and it's across the whole organisation from top to bottom and back down. So later on in the slides, we're going to be going through a pyramid, which will show some of the sort of hierarchy. And what I want to sort of get across today is that risk is something that's regular, that's ongoing and embedded in your culture, your organisation's culture. So next slide. So what's the difference between risk, uncertainty and issues? And this is, some of you will be familiar with this Johari window. So this is to explain rooms that others see or don't see. So this is an adaptation of this. So one is your known. So this is the common sense things. So when we're looking at risk, this is things that are always on the risk register, statutory authority delays. Hopefully there's no one here from any statutory authorities, but they're always on the risk. Your number 2, your known unknowns. So these are the things that we know about, but actually we need a bit of extra technical expertise. So you might want to get an environmental survey to find a bit more about it. 3 is our unknown knowns. So this is our own blind spot. So things we weren't aware of, but we know that others are in similar situations. So just like what we're doing today and we'll be doing in the workshops. So number 4 is your unknown knowns. So these are things that we're aware of and we don't understand. So this is where we probably, say it's uncertainty. So something in the future, people always also talk about the black swan event. So something that's rare, extreme, has an extreme impact, but maybe retrospective predictability. You might argue a pandemic would fall under that category. So an issue, on the other hand, as we all know, is the risk occurring right now and that we have to deal with it. So in terms of organisational culture then, so next slide. If risk management concerns the whole organisation, we could say that there's a hierarchy of risks. So all the way from the strategic organisational level, we'll be talking about defining risk appetite, through to the operational risk at project risk register and manager level, who will be getting their information from things like working risk assessments, so your on-site RAMS assessment, construction management plans, and that sort of thing. So this ring around the structure and the hierarchy are the stages of risk identification and analysis, and then working through what you might want to do is mitigation and monitoring and reporting. So we're going to cover this later on. So next slide. So this slide is showing a scale between what you might have heard. We've all heard of risk averse potentially and maybe risk receptive. So councils delivering public services and public funds, they've probably in the past, we've always taken a more robust and maybe less risky approach than housing associations and developers, particularly with regards to development. So I think this is talking about what the extent to which we're going to accept risk, or your organisation accepts risk. So what we might want to think about is, where do we fit on this scale? Where does our organisation fit? And I'll be talking about a few things today. I know some local authorities have certain types of risk that they want that they put on this scale. So you might have financial and regulatory, reputational and political. You might want to look at environmental, legal, programme, compliance and health and safety and quality. So it's kind of working out, well, what would your organisation accept for each of these? What's the benchmark? So next slide. I won't cover them all. So the first one is financial and regulatory. Now, this is a really chunky slide, so I'm not going to go into huge detail, but it's just to be aware that obviously these are huge and key risks. So the quote there that you can see from the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy is saying that the council and self-financing HRA will more closely resemble the finances of HA. So therefore, it stands to reason that it's closely tied with, say, the regulator for social housing. So looking at governance, which is about having the right skills, experience and expertise, the right strategy, and also having some scrutiny from committee members and any portfolio holders. There's been issues where RPs have been downgraded or regraded for not addressing audit recommendations, or for inadequate stress testing or incomplete mitigation strategies. So, if there was a removal of the debt cap, yay, hooray, but actually still need to service the debt. Will the building safety bill, net zero, decent homes 2, once all of that's accounted for, will that curtail any new delivery? And how does your development delivery pipeline fit in with the existing things that we need to do? So it's also about stress testing that development pipeline as well against other factors such as rental incomes, Obviously, government brought in the rent reduction for 4 years, so could that be stress tested against the business plan? It's just to note there that, you know, the scenario testing, the perfect storm or a domino risk isn't a forecast, and it's dependent on many factors. I know we've talked before about local authorities aren't as exposed, say, to market risk, but what would we do if the market crashes, and how would that delayed income in terms of rent impact on the business more widely? So it's that, you know, again, lots of things in there. Yeah, we'll cover on to the next slide. So the next slide is covering organisational culture. So it's really important, I think, if the goal is to have more housing, it's got to be clearly defined within the overall strategy, and that everybody works together, not in silos, and creates enabling relationships. That's what the best local authorities do, and they have a good communication between housing, between planning, asset management, legal and finance teams as well. Part of setting up that risk appetite as well is development new? Is it familiar? Or have we not done it before? Have we done smaller schemes before? We're going to be doing larger schemes. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll sort of cover teamwork and collaboration, but I think a big one for a big risk when determining risk appetite is reputational and political risk. So let's say, you know, we know that political and reputation risk are different compared to registered providers. You know, if a development fails or if it goes over budget, there's a political reputational risk there, and the threat of not being re-elected. I've got a picture of the England football team there. You know, they certainly do have some reputational risk being footballers. I suppose what I'm trying to say there is that if you don't, there might be people who in terms of football, you might have to, it's harder for councils to walk away, so you might need an exit strategy, or maybe plan B. In terms of people who want to be partnership working, they might say, actually, I don't want to invest in you anymore. It's like the Ronaldo with the Coca-Cola or something. So partnership JVs are often one solution, providing obviously the scale warrants. So do we have, do councils have our own housing company? Do we use the same contractor developer for all the works? Can they scale up? You know, what about if they're okay with schemes under 50 units? What about larger regeneration schemes? It's also good to get experience of any external project team. It's good to develop our internal skills like we're doing today, but do we have specialist experience if the scheme is larger? So say a large scale heating plant or on regeneration sites. So that's something to be aware of. So next slide. How do we build our risk map? How do we, and this sort of broadly relates to the pyramid that we saw with project risk registers feeding into the group risk register, the next level, up to the top level risks. So this is building a map to make sure that we're not, along the chain, we're not missing any risks, I suppose. This is the assurance map. So, and it's creating that culture of risk management and establishing responsibilities. You wouldn't expect operational staff to be setting the risk appetite, and so it works both ways. So each manager will have their own register of all those operational risks, and operational risks might be legal, such as relating to building safety and fire. It might be technological, the fact that we're all working remotely, or most of us are working remotely. There might be cybersecurity issues, things like that. Environmental, we've got COVID in there, and that could probably cover all of the different operational risks actually. So I think the idea here is that if there's any risk registers at that initial level, it will then go up the chain and it'll be escalated to that audit and risk committee, so the 3, 4, however many risks, and those escalated risks might then also go up to any lead member or portfolio holders if it needs ministerial attention. So these could happen, again, it could be a monthly team meeting, it could be line management meeting every 6 weeks, it could be quarterly, it could be bi-monthly. So it's whatever you want to bring in. The next slide is also, and I won't go into too much detail on this, this broadly follows, so when we're talking about project, this broadly follows the REBA design stages, which BPTW are going to go into in more detail. But I just wanted to point out that this is another way of bringing in risk and managing risk. So a lot of us would be familiar with having a gateway approval at pre-planning stage and sort of, you know, budget, setting out your budget and what you're going to do. And same going through the detailed design, maybe gateway 2 typically before tender, gateway 3 typically before appointing a contractor or developer. Whereas gateway 4 is, I don't think a lot of HAs or RPs or LAs really look at this gateway. This is the before occupation gateway, which the building safety regulator for fire safety is keen to bring in before the occupation of those buildings. So as I say, BPW is going to go into that, but that's another way of bringing in that gateway approval. And that approach also allows a buy-in from all of the departments, each of that gateway stage as well. So, okay, so next slide. So how do we build a risk register? So we can use risk capture and identification techniques such as PESTLE and SWOT, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. The main thing here that I want to say is to keep it realistic. So perhaps not alien invasion, but it's also creating that risk register as a project team, because sometimes it's worth someone who sits outside your project team to act as mediator, to give a perspective. And it leads back to the sort of known unknowns. Someone else might say, oh yeah, that's not a risk. I've done that before and this is what you can do about it. And it's drawing on that collective experience. Otherwise you could end up with a huge list of unknowns. And it's also quite worthwhile sometimes pretend that you're handing over the project to them tomorrow. That's, often, certainly focuses minds on risks. So it's important for us to scan the outside world and keep up to date with changes to the sector, so fire changes, for example, and it's being flexible. So what does the risk, so for the next slide, please. So what does a risk register look like? There are so many different risk registers and it will depend on how simple you want to keep it, and many organisations, the one that Redloft use, we use a risk matrix. There are some local authorities I know that are looking at streamlining this and having it electronic and part of a programme, so reports can be drawn from it as well. So, but most of them all follow a similar pattern where you work out how likely your risks are to occur and how catastrophic they would be. Are there any killer risks to your project or to the organisation? Are you going to get any press headlines? What the levels of impact are going to be? Are they going to be minor and negligible all the way through to severe or critical? So what we would do is start off evaluating the risk as it is today, and we like to put in some proximity. So is it going to happen in the near future or a year or two away? Is it going to add any cost or time delays onto that? Then we would manage that risk. Then we would take a different approach. Are we going to avoid that risk? So let's take rights of light as an example. Let's just not bother building anything above a certain rights of light issue. Do we control or mitigate? And actually, okay, we'll do a little bit. So we'll reduce some of it or reduce the impact of it. Do we accept? Say, okay, we're going to take a chance. We know roughly how much it's going to cost to compensate people. So we'll increase our budget accordingly. or should we transfer it? So we might want to outsource it, we'll give it to the contractor, or we'll procure some insurance. So once we've taken those attitudes towards risk, we then have a post-management or assessment, and then that's when you're left with any residual risk, and that's the risk that you will then start to manage. And that will be generally on a monthly basis. So if we go to the next slide, again, I won't go into too much detail because I know Mira's going to be covering development risk and her experience later in slides, but the key is knowing your project, and knowing all the usual suspects is key to building a good register. So, you know, early site visits, especially working remotely, we've come to rely on Google Maps and desktop analysis, but there's nothing like going to site to seeing where there's this pylon going across the whole thing. So next slide, just to sort of start to realise how the risk register then should be integrated with your financial appraisal. So once you've done all that due diligence and you've got a better idea of all those potential pitfalls, let's again take rights of light as an example, you'll then be able to put that early on in your budget. So I think the key here, this slide is showing, if we spend money earlier at the earlier stages on those surveys, then it's much more expensive to find out later on in the project that this was a known or could have been a known. When we had to make the changes later on in the project, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And I suppose the last thing is once we've got that financial appraisal, usually there's a sort of set of assumptions that only represent one scenario. So it's really for the individual as well, the project manager, to say, well, what happens if the values increase? Say, what happens if the rental incomes come down? What if your construction costs go up by 5%, 10%? And then that is when you will then have a more stress tested risk register that's linking to finance. So last slide. Got a few conclusions there. Main thing is getting senior involvement and linking your risk to the corporate objectives. It's setting a positive culture of risk management, so not having the blame culture. So you can, if you've got a risk that's going to be coming up, you can report it, and there's not going to be any blame associated to it. To maybe appoint risk champions, and so consider risk in a broad context. So using those environmental, political experience, simplifying it, because if it's too complicated, no one will do it. Sharing collective experience like we're doing today, as well as sharing experience between, you know, peer-to-peer within councils. It's learning from developers and housing associations, and actually other organisations as well, someone completely, you know, left field. And then it's implementing any lessons learned as well. So what you learned on project 1 or project 2 will then implement across future schemes, and training as well. So training is an important one, like we're doing today, but it's also risk registers are supposed to be objective, but they can be quite subjective, and what one person thinks is a risk, someone else might not think is so much of a risk, and it depends on the scale of the scheme and everything else. So it's making sure that everybody's risk register is saying similar things, otherwise it could become skewed. And active management. So we've already talked about the various times where we can look at risk, so at gateway approvals or monthly meetings, for example. So that last quote, I've got a bit of Mark Zuckerberg here. The biggest risk is not taking any risk. In a world that's changing really quickly, the only strategy that's guaranteed to fail is not taking risks. I always think the risk management, a good risk management saves a lot of van cleaning, is probably my favourite quote. So I'll leave it there, because I know we've got some questions potentially. I know we're going to be leading on to other presentations. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. I realised that my screen has frozen for a moment, so we've not seen your last slide. I don't know if it's suddenly going to jump. But thank you so much. Your next slide, your conclusions, which you ran through there, were really useful. And what I've really picked up from your presentation is quite a strong emphasis really on really using all your resources, bringing people in, making sure that you get as many perspectives in as possible. To get the risk map as tight and as comprehensive as it needs to be, but also to make the right judgment calls. So yeah, that was really helpful. So I'll just emphasize that your slides are a takeaway for the live audience. We'll be sending that out to attendees.
I'm Neil Campbell. I'm a partner architect at BPTW. I'm going to be talking about the design risk management process and how this sits within the wider project risk management process, which is very helpfully outlined by Sam and Tom from Medloft there just before me. I'm also going to touch on the things that you as clients should bring into this process, and of course your responsibilities and ours. Next slide, please. So starting with the statutory position, currently under the construction design and management regulations, and within the remit of the health and safety executive, it's the responsibility of the client to appoint a principal designer on every job. So these quotes are a little bit small, but I'm going to just pick a few bits out of them. A principal designer is a designer who is an organisation or individual appointed by the client to take control of the pre-construction phase of any project involving more than one contractor. Principal designers have an important role in influencing how risks to health and safety are managed throughout a project. Design decisions made during the pre-construction phase have a significant influence, ensuring the project is delivered in a way that secures the health and safety of everyone affected by the work. So that's taken from the construction design and management regulations, and the principal designer role is a very important one in respect of design risk, and is very much part of the project team, and we interact very closely with a principal designer. The role ensures that the wider team and the client sensibly plan the work so that risks involved are managed from the start, have the right people for the right job at the right time, cooperate and coordinate the work of others, have the right information about the risks and how they're going to be managed, and communicate information effectively to those who need to know. As architects, we also have duties as part of the CDM regulations, and I will go on to talk about how we approach these through the design process. An important turning point, obviously, in the last few years, following the Grenfell Tower disaster, the government has asked the Health and Safety Executive to establish a new safety regulator, and this will overlap with the current regulations. And the principal designer role will continue to have a role, but it's likely to be enhanced and more regulated. And there is a whole session dedicated to this, I think, Visika, coming up later in relation to the Building Safety Bill. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we're seeing changes implemented now, and that it's going to have a significant impact on the way that health and safety and risk management is managed going forwards. So it's just worth putting the flag down, and I'm sure everyone's aware of what's going on, but we're going to return to that in some detail in the coming months. So next slide, please. Now, many of you will be familiar with the RIBA Plan of Works, and as Sam pointed out in her presentation, this is a really helpful way to break down the design and construction process into stages. So it goes from 0 to 7. There's core activity in each stage, and I've put this slide up because it's very helpful for project planning, and it's the way that we as architects work through these stages. And as noted in the presentation before, it's also a framework for considering your own milestones as clients, and in particular those risk milestones that everyone needs to engage with. So as you move through the stages from one to the next, the risk profile of the project is considered at each stage. And something that just resonated from the presentation before is considering a sort of milestone like you're handing over the project. So we consider this process as handing over the project from one stage to the next, and that's a key milestone to consider all areas of the design, but in particular in the context of today's discussion, the risk profile and how that moves from one stage to the next. So next slide, please. At BPTW, we have our own internal documentation and we follow a design risk management process. And the next few slides look at how we approach every project and what we look at in terms of design risk. Many of these things require client input or action to help mitigate the risks as far as practically possible in relation to the specific design stage. But the main point is that the risks are identified and continuously monitored as you move through the design process from one stage to the next. So here, what we're going to look at is just some site issues, and I've picked out a few things here that have caused us issues and certainly our clients issues in the past. And so we look at, so looking at a site afresh, and there's an example of a site here. So one very important thing is site ownership, and so the legal position of the site ownership, so the red line. Are we sure that all the land is within your ownership? It's particularly complicated for local authorities, because I think sometimes the red line could be a bit arbitrary, because you may own land beyond the red line as well, but you may not, and it just really depends on where that red line is cast within your estates. So that's one really important thing. And then looking at the boundary conditions and then the ownership positions around the boundaries as another extremely important thing, that on having an on-the-ground check. And as noted, like one of the things that's happened in the last year or so is not having the ability to go to sites really hampered this. So wherever possible, we will go and physically look at the site as soon as we can, as soon as practically as possible, because there will always be something that you can't understand or see from behind the screen. Another really important thing that we come across on often is public rights of way and not understanding where they are or if they're there at an early stage, and that's part of a kind of legal overview of the position and your interaction with your own legal team on specifically that aspect. We recommend the instructions of key site surveys early on, and a couple noted here: a topographical survey. We can't rely on kind of OS information as you move through kind of design process. We need to have very detailed site information to help establish what the constraints and risks are of considering development on site. There might be contamination risk. That's a survey that is often undertaken very early. Flood risk, another one. And if we're considering utilising or interacting with existing buildings, having a measured survey of whatever that structure is, another very important thing. We can only go so far with sort of lightweight information, because it won't be accurate, and ultimately that will lead to a risk in what the development proposal could be. Next slide, please. So considering site issues further, so moving around the site. So one of the things we consider very early on is the approach and access, how you get into the site. Is it easily accessed by pedestrian or vehicle? Are there buildings on the site that are either staying or will be in close proximity to any proposal perhaps? Were there buildings on the site that have been demolished? And if they're not there now, are there any records of what was there? Because that's going to give us some indication of what might be underground. Following on from the topographical survey and the site visit is, are there level differences? There nearly always are in some capacity. And here's a couple of images of a very typical site that I'm sure that you have many of. Bottom image there, there's a retaining structure there. There's a tree that looks like it's hanging over, probably in relatively poor condition. And there in the background lurking is a substation. That will mean that there are services in there underground all over the place, but when you walk around the surface you don't necessarily know they're there. So utilities is one that again is a really, really important one early on, because it's not immediately obvious where they are, and it can be linked to a topographical and a tracing survey that we do early on to understand where those services run, because some of them might not be able to be moved, and moving services it causes great expense. So better we know about them at the beginning so that we can consider them and build around them, rather than consider that they might all have to move and as a consequence create greater expense later on. Existing trees is another one, and understanding where they are, how big they are, and the quality of them is another important factor. And I think another thing that we've learned, and particularly in kind of developing in on local authority land, existing trees can, and trying to, the retention of can immediately create something a positive. So we don't want to walk onto the site considering that all the trees might be removed. Far from it. We want to consider that we'd want to find a way of them all staying. But if we're going to do that, we need to know everything about them and where they are. So next slide, please. And then just moving through to considering beyond the red line, we have to think about the neighbouring structures. Are there buildings or structures within close proximity? And there is particular kind of criteria that are flags in relation to party wall agreements. And when they come into play, that's something that needs to be understood early on in the process. We also need to understand the proximity of neighbouring buildings in relation to fire safety, and also in relation to considering proposals and potential impact of sunlight and daylight and rights of light, and all of these things that we would want to have a good understanding of early on, so that it gives us a sense of the kind of development envelope that we could be considering without undue risk of having a negative impact on neighbouring properties. And when we start moving into considering our designs, we have to think about basements. That's definitely a big one. Not something we come across a lot in local authorities, but it does happen sometimes, and it may be partial basement in relation to a sloping site, perhaps. And when also how the building might be constructed, in particular access for scaffolding. So if you're building close to a boundary, is there room? Have we left enough room to actually build and undergo the construction safely? And most likely that will involve a scaffold of some sort, and that requires room and working room around the whole perimeter. We also have to think about where cranes might be installed, and we're in the world of modern methods of construction. I know we've talked about it in this forum as well, but considering modern methods of construction, and the slide here is an example of something we did, which is a modular approach. That has to be considered very, very early in the process in relation to the risks that poses on a development profile, because access to the site and crane access might be something that actually determines the shape of the building. And you may not think that at the beginning, but that it was the case in this building, and limited the building footprint as a consequence, because the crane can only be positioned in a certain number of locations, and it can only be really be positioned within land ownerships that are controlled by you as a client, or that you're able to negotiate control over. Next slide, please. So we move through the process and consider design features as we realise our designs in a bit more detail, and there are critical height thresholds as well, for example. So we need to think as you consider a building of more height, there are measures in place at certain levels above ground that trigger different types of legislation, particularly around fire safety. We look at features like deck access and balconies, and we need to think about how they are safely designed, particularly falling from height, which and as buildings get taller, these considerations become more apparent, and as you get taller even more, you have to think about things like wind, etc., and those kind of constraints will inform the design process going forwards. We also need to think about future maintenance, and it's extremely important, I suppose, from your other colleagues. We often have a series of kind of workshops through the design process to consider this. Developments are getting more and more complicated by the day through the kind of technology that is now mostly on the roof, and roofs and access to the roofs become ever more important. We usually end up with needing access to a rooftop plant on a regular basis, and that has to be planned in from the beginning. So how do you access the roof? How do you get up there safely? And that needs to be thought about through the design process. Also, a couple of other things that we think are very important in the design process are window cleaning strategy, because that will inform the type of windows that we design, how they open, and particularly at height, how they're cleaned and how they open, extremely important. And all these things are, as you move through the process, are triggers for discussion across the whole design team so that we can come up with a design that as best we can mitigate some of these risks. I think what was pointed out very clearly in the presentation before is that development is inherently risky, but it's the process you follow to mitigate the design risk as far as possible. So next slide, please. What we do is then pull all this together in a design hazard register, and this is our part of it as architectural designers. It's a live document, and we update this regularly, identifying any of the risks through the process. So this will be updated constantly, but most importantly, and at those kind of stage positions, moving from 0 to 1, 1 and 2, there's a more kind of formal process where our design risk register is combined with the wider project risk registered, via the principal designer, and so that all that is collected in one singular place. Because although we have our this has a risk register, there will be multiple others that sit within other disciplines, and it's a very important process to bring all these together, and that really is at the heart of what the principal designer does. And then that interaction between the principal designer and you as a client, equally important. So we have a project risk register, but some of these project risks might go into your wider risk mapping as an organization, and actually might find them further up the tree if they're particularly important. And the graph springs to mind that Sam talked through earlier, and how those two things interrelate each other is particularly important, because there is no point in all of these things being done in isolation, because something will be forgotten or miscommunicated along the way. So we categorize risk broadly in the way that I've talked through those design features, constructions, use and maintenance, and that's how we organize our hazard risk register. And there are a lot of versions of these, but they all attempt to do the same thing. And I suppose one important point about this is it remains live, because it's the risk management process never really finishes, and so that we're constantly looking and monitoring this until the end of a particular process. So hopefully that's been helpful. I've briefly gone through the design risk management process as we see it as architects, and how this fits into the wider project risk management process. There are important actions for you as a client, and the information that you need to source and provide for the design team to help us mitigate design risks. And hopefully I've highlighted some of these, but happy to have a conversation in the next part of the presentation. I've also made reference to the Building Safety Bill and how this is going to change the way that health and safety is regulated through the HSE, and we will go on to explore this in a bit more detail in a later webinar. So thank you for that, and look forward to the discussion in the breakout rooms. Over to you, Visika.